Today in the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, round 2.
Votes in favour, 401. According to these results, the candidate for President of the European Commission proposed by the European Council is therefore elected by the European Parliament. I would like to congratulate Ursula von der Leyen on her re-election. And I wish
Ursula von der Leyen convinced 401 members of the European Parliament to vote in her favour out of 707. This time, she was re-elected as Commission President with a 41-vote lead, emerging from the very first plenary with a stronger mandate. Before the vote, Ursula von der Leyen delivered a lengthy speech in which she reached out to centrist and left-wing parties while excluding the far right. She outlined the priorities for her next mandate, appearing more assertive than ever, but also raising some questions. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori, and this is Today in the EU. The entire Euractiv team of reporters was in Strasbourg this week to cover and report on this crucial plenary. However, to break down all that happened during the vote for the President of the European Commission, we are joined by our politics editor, Aurélie Pugnet. Aurélie, we're back at it.
Hi, Evi. Yes.
You're still in Strasbourg following the very first crucial meeting of the newly elected and re-elected MEPs. And of course, everyone was focusing on the re-election of Ursula von der Leyen. There's a lot to unpack regarding her speech before the vote and the messaging she wanted to pass. But first, let's start with the vote result and the voting process itself.
So von der Leyen managed to gather more than 400 votes, 401. Pretty good margin if you think about it. Last time in 2019, when she passed the vote again, she only had 9 extra votes. This time, she actually has more than 40 extra votes. What's interesting to notice is actually that she's getting even a stronger mandate than she did last time, which we weren't really sure about. We didn't know how big her margin would be. It was clearly a tense moment. Because obviously the right-wing, far right-wing forces have a lot of seats in the new parliament, and the Conservatives are headed, by Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister. Her right arm here, Nicola Procaccini, said the majority of the group would not vote for her. So what we can understand with this is that the Greens were really, really, really important for her to win the vote and to actually get that majority.
And it looks like she got the support from the Greens, but do you think she also gathered some votes from the far right side of the parliament as well? Like ECR, they did say they wouldn't vote for her, but the number is quite high for only S&D, EPP and the Greens to have voted for her.
You're very right. So the platform that she could count on was around 400, exactly the number of votes that she got. But we do know that part of that alliance voted against her. For example, the German Liberals, the FDP, or the French Républicains, like we expected. So she had to go elsewhere. And so the Greens obviously managed to compensate for some of that loss, but probably weren't enough. So what we can expect is definitely that she got a few votes from the Conservatives. It is a delegation line, so each delegation and each party within the group decides whether they want to vote in favor or against. So we can definitely imagine that some of those people supported her in the end. It is a secret ballot, so you can always say that you voted against because you want to look good to your group and to your friends and allies, or on the contrary, say you voted in favor and when actually you didn't, or you did the opposite. And she had a very left-wing speech, very focused on the centrist and very much excluding the very far right of the hemicycle. So I would not be surprised if she also gathered a few more votes in the far left. She talked about social rights, housing, and also a little bit, in the Conservatives, thanks to her policy on migration.
And what were the first reactions to the result of the vote?
I would say relief. There were applause, obviously, by people who support her, and a sense of, okay, how did you get that much? There was clearly no obvious plan B if she could not make it. So there was definitely a little bit of concerns about this. Even yesterday, we were talking to people here in Strasbourg. The team was in touch with MEPs and they were saying, well, we can't be sure until the very last second. So we have to all stick together and make sure that the centrist groups and the 4 main groups, which are the centre-right, the socialists, the liberals and the Greens, stick together to get that majority. So there was a bit of concerns until last minute, but we also saw certain group leaders talking to each other, nodding at each other, saying, yes, which is good, we've got you covered. So we were feeling pretty confident until we got some understanding that maybe a large part of maybe of the Conservatives didn't vote for her, that we saw that some of the Greens voted against. So there was a bit of blur. But yeah, she made it actually with quite an impressive lead, I would say.
Now, the result doesn't really come as a surprise. As you already mentioned, some MEPs were telling you that this would probably be the result. And even the atmosphere in the room during her speech was preparing us for what was going to happen. But what were the main points of the speech?
What von der Leyen mentioned and what I was saying earlier is that her speech, which was basically her laying down her program for the next 5 years, it was very much focused on the centrist and the left-wing parties. So you heard, for example, social rights or being mentioned, for example, housing. It's not something that you hear about, the fact that some European citizens cannot find a home. But fair housing opportunities, for example, was mentioned.
Prices and rents are soaring. People are struggling to find affordable homes. This is why, for the first time, I will appoint a commissioner with a direct responsibility for the topic of housing.
Something else that she talked about is obviously the future of the Green Deal, which has been a big question, her position on this. She managed to keep a stance that is that she wants to have an industrial policy for the bloc. But she can't completely ignore the fact that the EU has to put forward climate-friendly policy and has to keep in mind the fact that there is a Green Deal and that there is an objective to reduce carbon emissions.
I will put forward a new clean industrial deal in the first 100 days of the next mandate. It will channel investment.
So she managed to keep a line that obviously was a bit of an issue for some Greens. For example, the French Greens were quite against her, wanting to water down, I would say, the regulation on the reduction of chemical products.
Yes, she indeed mentioned the new clean industrial deal. And to her, her flagship policy, the Green Deal, is very important to continue. Do you think these two policies will be interconnected somehow?
They will definitely be connected. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges of her for the next mandate. So she passed thanks to the Greens, right? Like I was saying earlier. So she's going to have to keep them on board if she wants her policies and her laws to pass in the next 5 years. But any sustainability related issue might run into the opposition of the more conservative, the more far right, the more even just business friendly parties, like in her own political family in the EPP. So she's going to have to make concessions to both sides, and keeping that majority together of the main grouping and the main parties that supported her through this election is going to be quite challenging when it's going to come to this clean, still green industrial policy.
Right, and we've already unpacked some of the other priorities VDL mentioned on the podcast before, like competitiveness and security and defense. Why was it interesting to focus on this?
So yes, she did mention competitiveness quite a bit. And what is interesting is that she kept talking about how the EU policies would need so much more money.
Our first priority will be prosperity and competitiveness. Those who stand still will fall behind. Those who are not competitive will be dependent. So the race is on, and I want Europe to switch gear.
But she didn't really explain how or where to get that money. That was quite interesting because it's obviously a huge issue. If you don't have money to finance your policies, they might run into some trouble. There has been discussions about maybe borrowing more on the markets. Maybe the Commission is going to propose a much higher common budget. That's something that we're going to have to keep in mind, and also where she puts the priority, because it's all nice and pretty to tell everyone on every side of the hemicycle and in every political family, yes, I'm going to give money to security and defense, I'm going to give money to migration, I'm going to give money for small and medium enterprises, I'm going to give money for housing. But at the end of the day,
where's it coming from?
Where's it coming from? And you can't give, you have to set priorities, and some are going to get more money than others. And that's, again, going to have to go through the parliament, and it's definitely going to have to go through a bit of debate and negotiations.
There was also the moment where Ursula von der Leyen talked about how some in Europe are playing along with Russia.
Russia is banking on Europe and the West going soft, and some in Europe are playing along. 2 weeks ago, a European Union Prime Minister went to Moscow. This so-called peace mission was nothing but an appeasement mission. This was a plain appeasement mission.
What predisposition does this show on how things will move forward with Viktor Orban and the Hungarian EU presidency?
Yes, she did make a reference to basically the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban, who has been on a tour across the world, meeting with different leaders on what he calls a peace mission. So he's been to Kiev, he's been to Moscow, he's been to Beijing, he's been to see Donald Trump, who is likely or might be re-elected as a US president in November. He wants to create a peace deal for Ukraine that doesn't go along the parameters that the majority of Europeans agree with, which is that Ukraine is the one that should be in charge of the peace mission. So yeah, she definitely criticized this part, and that attracted a bit of backlash, I would say, in the parliament, and a bit of a situation with a member of the parliament from SOS who's sitting in the far-right group, basically calling out von der Leyen. Everyone that supports Orban, you could tell, applauded Orban basically when von der Leyen was criticizing him. And then that's when von der Leyen kind of used a higher tone. She wasn't screaming at all, but she
was very assertive.
She imposed herself. Exactly, very assertive. It was nothing like an appeasement mission. It's not what you should have done. It's not helpful. And that definitely plays in the hands of everyone who supports Ukraine, because that goes along all those policies according to which the EU will support Ukraine as long as it takes. But it does go against everyone that sits further to the right of her own political family. So part of the Conservatives, the Patriots and the Sovereignists.
Now, how different will this second round be for Ursula von der Leyen? What are the voices within the parliament saying?
It's a bit early to see exactly what the term will look like. What was interesting out of the speech and was definitely expected is that she mentioned buzzwords, and it was a little bit of a Christmas tree, which means that she mentioned a lot of policies without maybe creating much of a priority setting list. So she's going to have to then come back to it and say, okay, here's the priority number one, here's the priority number two. And this is where maybe there's going to be a little bit of challenge. And then that's going to be seen, like I was saying, when it's going to come to setting the budget for it. And in any case, I think what we can see is that having a parliament that is in any case very much looking towards the right and to the far right and to the conservativeness means that social and climate-friendly policies might be more difficult to put into place. I mean, she did get 401 votes, but also almost 300 voted against her. So it is a majority, that's not a problem. And over the past term, she had a much lower majority and she made it quite fine. I mean, there's a lot of her policies that went through. But the opposition is a lot more vocal this time and is given a lot more attention. That is because, you have leaders that from European countries like Italy or like Hungary and former big prime ministers like the Slovene Janša or in Czechia Babiš, whose groups and whose political families are in the parliament, and they will make sure that they are very, very vocal, and they will push to have more migration management policies, to have maybe different kind of social rights or less sustainability.
Thank you very much, Aurélie. And I know that the entire team has been reporting on policy-specific topics, so don't miss on these articles on our website. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. You can get in touch with us by leaving a comment or a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, but also understand what topics you like listening to. This episode was produced by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, Nicoleta Yonta, and me. Thank you for tuning in, and we will be back on Monday morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.